There is an assignment that is due 1 week from today. I just made it available now on Canvas. If you go to Canvas in the assignment section, you should see a link for assignment 2 that has all the instructions on there. The basic idea for this assignment, and this is should be an easy one, but the basic idea here is that you're going to go to a website. The website link is in the assignment that you can see on Canvas. On that website, you're going to partake in an implicit association test. In fact, you're going to partake in 2 implicit association tests. I had briefly mentioned what an implicit association test is when we talked about attitudes. It's sometimes called the IAT for short. I talked about how it's a way of measuring implicit attitudes, the attitudes we're not even aware of having. And I had mentioned at the time, I think, that I was going to have you take them for an assignment. So this is that assignment. Each test should take like 10 minutes or so, okay? When you get to that website, you're going to see a list of about 14 different tests. You can choose to take any 2 tests that you want to take from that list. Okay? As I said, it takes about 10 minutes or so to go through each test. At the end of the test, it's going to tell you that you have a slight, moderate, or strong, or no preference for one group over another group. I'm going to show you what that looks like. Hang on. Okay, so you should see something like this at the end of this test, saying you've completed the study. During the IAT you just completed, your responses suggested a preference for one group of people over another group of people, and you're going to see a breakdown of how other people score on that test as well. What I want you to do is, once you complete both these tests, just so I know that you took them, I want you to take a screenshot of this page for each of the 2 tests that you did, okay? And I then want you to copy and paste them into a document that you're going to be submitting. For each one of these results pages that you submit, that's worth 2 points. So if you submit 2 of them, that's 4 points out of 4 right there. Okay? For the other 6 points in the assignment, what I want you to do is to explain in 1 paragraph, okay? You don't need to write pages for this, just 1 paragraph, how the IAT works. And I'm not asking you like mechanically what you did in the IAT, like you press this key or you press this key. I'm not asking you that. I'm asking logically, what is the logic behind how the IAT is measuring people's implicit attitudes? And this is going to be an easy question for you to answer, because if you go to that website, what you're going to see is under the frequently asked questions section, the 3rd question down is, how does the IAT measure implicit attitudes and stereotypes? And there's a whole paragraph that describes how it measures implicit attitudes and stereotypes. Okay? Do not copy word for word from this response. Obviously, if you do that, that's plagiarism. You get a 0 on the assignment. But you can read through this so you can understand how the IAT works. And if you still need more information, feel free to Google how the IAT works as well. And in your own words, I want you to write up 1 paragraph explaining the logic behind how the IAT works. That's worth 6 points. Okay, so 6 points for that paragraph, and then 2 points for each of the 2 results pages. That's 10 points for the assignment. Okay. As I mentioned, when you get that results page, I'm assuming it's easiest if you just sort of copy and paste this into a Word document. So in your Word document, you'd have your 1 paragraph as well as the 2 results pages pasted into that document. It's probably the easiest way to submit this, I imagine. Okay, so you should be able to see assignment 2 right now in Canvas. That's going to be due, as I said, 1 week from today. That's due at 5 o'clock at the beginning of class. Okay, make sure you get it submitted by 5 p.m. on Thursday, November 5th. Incidentally, the IAT, we're going to talk a little bit more about the IAT when we talk about stereotyping. We're not going to get to that until after exam 3, but I have another assignment I wanted to give to you after assignment 3, and I didn't want to give you 2 assignments in the same quarter of the semester, which is why I'm giving you this assignment now, but we will come back to talk about stereotyping, and we'll see how the IAT relates to stereotyping later on. Okay, with that being said, we are going to pick up where we left off last class. So we were talking about obedience last class, and in particular, we were talking about Milgram's obedience studies. These are probably the most famous studies in all of social psychology. And so, where did this go? Hold on. Okay, so I had talked to you about Milgram's obedience studies. I'd explained what they are. Just to refresh your memory, let's pass that. Just to refresh your memory, these are the studies where people believe they were administering electric shocks to someone. And as they delivered stronger and stronger what they believed were electric shocks to this person was in increasing distress. They started screaming and saying they wanted the experiment to end. And at one point, they just fell silent and you never heard from them again. And the point of the study was to show that people have this natural tendency to obey authority figures. So in this case, these participants were obeying an experimenter. And this power that we have, or this tendency we have to obey authority figures is so strong that it tended to even override people's desire to not hurt another person. I think that this study can be easily misinterpreted, and some people believe that the study shows the hidden cruelty that people possess or something, and that's not what the study shows. The study does not show that people are inherently cruel. The participants in the study were extraordinarily uncomfortable. They hated being part of the study. They hated making this decision about whether to obey the experimenter and keep delivering these electric shocks to someone, or to disobey the experimenter and to cut the experiment short. And people struggled with this decision. But because this tendency to obey was so strong, the majority of people delivered the strongest possible shocks. This went up to 450 volts in the shock generator. The majority of people, about 2/3, delivered the strongest possible shocks because of this tendency we have to obey others. Now, the experiment, as I described it to you last class and recapped it just now, is only one variation of the study that Milgram did. Milgram wanted to look at factors that made it more or less likely that people would obey as well. And so he ran some variations on this paradigm where he manipulated various things to look at the factors that affected obedience. And I want to talk just briefly about some of those factors now. So first off, there are a few factors associated with the authority figure that were related to people's tendency to obey. There were two in particular that he looked at. The first one was the physical presence of the authority figure. And so in the variation that I described to you, the experimenter was always in the same room as the participant. They were sitting sort of behind the participant. But in other variations, Milgram manipulated the presence of the experimenter, so that in some variations, the experimenter wasn't even in the room, but was on the phone. And so the participant was talking to the experimenter on the phone, and the experimenter was giving his orders to continue delivering electric shocks over the phone. And in that condition, obedience rates tend to drop off. There's a third condition in which I believe the experimenter left like written instructions about what they need to do, and the participant didn't even hear the experimenter. And in those conditions, obedience rates drop off dramatically. So the basic idea here is that the closer the person is, physically closer the person is giving these orders, the harder it is to disobey them. We tend to obey people when they're physically present versus when they're not. In another variation of the study, he manipulated the legitimacy or the perceived legitimacy of the study. And so the original study was associated with Harvard. In some variations of the study, instead of going into Harvard to be in the study, the participants went to kind of like a rundown warehouse. I believe that the study was supposedly associated with like a small community college. The experimenter didn't have a white lab coat. So they basically reduced the perceived legitimacy of the study. And when they reduced the perceived legitimacy, then obedience rates also dropped off. So part of the reason so many people potentially obeyed in the original Milgram study was because it was associated with a high credibility institution, with Harvard. Okay? If you reduce that, then obedience rates drop off. There were also factors associated with the learner, the person who was receiving the electric shocks, in other words, that affected obedience rates. So in the variation that I described to you last class, the learner, the person who received the shocks, was in a separate room from the participants. The participants could hear them through the wall, but they couldn't actually see them, right? So in another variation, the learner, the person receiving these shocks, was in the same room as the participant. So if you're one of these participants and you deliver a shock to this person, you can actually see that person suffering as opposed to only being able to hear them. In a third condition, participants actually had to take the learner's arm and hold it onto this metal plate in order to deliver shocks. They had to make physical contact with the learner. And as you can probably imagine, as the physical presence of the victim increases, then obedience rates decrease. when you can see the physical pain this person is in, people are less likely to deliver shocks, which is kind of a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how you look at it. I mean, it's a good thing in the sense that we can reduce obedience and people can empathize with others when they can actually see them. On the other hand, what that also means is that it's more difficult to empathize with others if they're not physically present. If they're somewhere far away on the other side of the world, it's easy to dismiss their suffering, potentially, right? There are also factors associated with the procedure itself that could have affected obedience rates. So first off, remember that in the study, participants started by giving 15 volts for the first mistake that the learner made. Then when the learner made the second mistake, they increased that to 30 volts. Then they increased it to 45 volts and 60 volts. And there's this gradual escalation all the way up to 450 volts, right? Well, this might sound somewhat familiar to you because it's bearing some similarities to the foot in the door technique that we looked at when we talked about compliance. If you remember foot in the door, if you get someone to comply to a small request, they become much more likely to agree to a larger request. And there's something kind of similar going on here. If you've gotten a participant to deliver the first 10 electric shocks, it becomes easier for them to deliver the 11th electric shock, right? I mean, after all, if I've given an electric shock at 240 volts, well, the next level is only 235 volts. It's only 15 volts more than 240. And I was willing to give a 240 volt shock. So it kind of tends to maintain this tendency I have to deliver the next highest shock, right? I mean, if I was willing to give a 240 volt shock, why wouldn't I be willing to deliver a 235? And if I delivered a shock at 235 volts, why wouldn't I deliver one at 250? And so the more shocks that they deliver to this person, the easier it is to sort of maintain that behavior. And so that tendency, that gradual escalation, likely increased the tendency to obey. If participants had to jump up 100 volts at a time, for instance, maybe they'd be less likely to do that because they wouldn't have gone through that gradual escalation. Finally, there were some variations of the study where the participant was not the only person that was supposedly delivering electric shocks, but rather there was a group of 3 people, 3 supposed participants who were all taking turns, like reading off the word pairs to the learner and delivering electric shocks, etc. But in this group of 3 participants, one of them was actually a confederate of the experimenter, and the confederate's job was at some point to dissent, to disobey the experimenter. So at some point, the confederate says, you know what, I'm not going to deliver electric shocks anymore. Now, what the researchers want to know is, well, the presence of this one dissenter, will that lead other people, the actual participants, to dissent as well? Are they also going to disobey at that point? Okay. And what happens is that, just like we saw in the conformity section, is that the presence of one single person who disobeys or who doesn't conform, one dissenter, drastically reduces the likelihood that other people will obey as well. In other words, if you have a partner who's disobeying, it's a lot easier for you to disobey the experimenter as well, because you've got another person there. Now, we cannot do these studies today. I mentioned this last class, is that for ethical reasons, we could not put participants through this study today. When these studies were done in the late 50s, early 60s, this is before we had established institutional review boards, IRBs, which review currently every study that I want to do. An IRB has to review it to make sure I'm treating participants ethically. And those didn't really exist at the time. As a consequence, Milgram could kind of get away with things that we couldn't get away with now for ethical reasons. As a consequence, people who study obedience today have used different paradigms to study this because they can't put people in a position where they believe they're potentially lethally harming another person. And there's a number of these paradigms that people have developed. And some of them are lab-based paradigms. Some of them are look at behavior in the real world. And this example is one of the latter. It's looking at obedience in the real world. So what happened is that they staged this study with the permission of a hospital. And they conducted this study on 22 nurses that were working in this hospital. Now, what happened is that the experimenter would call the hospital, talk to the nurse, or talk to a nurse there, and would tell the nurse to administer a certain drug to a specific patient. Now, there were multiple reasons why the nurses should not have obeyed this person. First off, it was against hospital rules to give orders on the phone. A doctor had to be in person and give an order in writing. They could not just give an order on the phone. So the nurses should have disobeyed for that reason. Secondly, the physician was unknown to the nurses. They weren't familiar with who this person was. Third, the drug they were told to administer, they were unfamiliar with. And on the label of the drug, it said that there were some very serious side effects if the drug was administered and if there was an overdose in particular. And the dose that the doctor had told the nurses to administer was an obvious overdose. So it had these really negative potential side effects. So for all of these reasons, these nurses never should have obeyed the doctor's order. And yet when they conducted the study, 21 out of 22 nurses immediately obeyed. Now, obviously, the researchers stopped them before they were able to actually administer any drugs. And this doesn't say anything about nurses' tendency to obey. Rather, it's just there's a more general phenomenon here, which is that we all have this tendency to obey authority figures, oftentimes without question. And that could be quite dangerous because people who want to manipulate you, who know that you have a tendency to obey, are able to get you to do things you otherwise wouldn't because of that tendency. So I think this is really important to understand about ourselves. In fact, there's numerous reasons why this study is one of the most famous studies in social psychology. But I think that one of the reasons is because it really holds a mirror up to ourselves. Because when we see that people in the Milgram study are willing to deliver lethal electric shocks to someone else, that study, the point of that study is not to say that those people are willing to administer lethal electric shocks. It's to hold a mirror up to ourselves and say, look, if those people can do it, that means you have the potential to do this as well. You have the potential to commit evil just because someone else told you to, because of this tendency to obey. And I think that learning about this study then creates some potential insight into ourselves. In fact, after the study was conducted, Milgram mailed some follow-up questionnaires to the participants like a year or two later and asked them a series of questions, including whether they were happy that they had participated. And something like 90-something% of the participants said that they were very happy to have participated because they learned something about themselves. They learned that they had the potential to do evil in the right circumstances if there was an authority figure telling them to do so. So I think people learned a lot from that study. So as I mentioned last class, though, although there are a lot of ethical restrictions facing researchers who want to conduct this study, and we can, as I said, we can never do it today. Those same restrictions don't necessarily apply to reality TV shows. And so I think this was about 12 years ago, something like that. There was a TV show that basically replicated the Milgram study, and they filmed it. And I have about a 10 or 12 minute clip that I want to show you from that study so we can see in more modern day if this tendency to obey still exists. Okay, and again, I think you should be able to hear the audio. If not, just let me know.
Seminar, I arranged to test the limits of their responsiveness to authority. So, a week ago, I arranged for them to take part in what they now think is a piece of unfilmed academic research at a university, and nothing to do with the show, supposedly looking into the effects of punishment on learning. And they believe now that this is part of their growth. In fact, it was a reenactment of a powerful experiment conducted by Stanley Milgram in 1963 to look at how normal people can commit atrocious acts simply because they're following orders. Milgram's parents were Jewish refugees in World War II, and his pioneering work speaks volumes about the nature of responsibility. It's being filmed with covert cameras.
Thank you.
They're introduced to an actor pretending to be another participant.
You didn't come from the same room?
No.
Yeah, you don't know each other.
No.
But we don't actually know how punishment affects learning.
After a brief introduction, our subjects are tricked into thinking they've chosen their role as teachers in the experiment.
And if you could just tell me what your positions are?
Learner.
Learner and teacher.
Learner.
Teacher.
Our subjects observe the learner being instructed by the scientist, who is just another actor.
This electrode is connected to a generator in the second room. We'll be going with the teacher.
Okay.
Just make sure that we have a good contact with the skin so it doesn't cause any blistering or burning. Is that comfortable?
That's okay, yeah.
Okay, and we just place these straps around your arms just to avoid any excess movement. Those aren't too tight.
No, that's okay.
No. The teacher will read out some word pairs to you. Blue girl.
The learner is told he's going to be asked a series of memory questions by the teacher. He will have to word pairs and then correctly remember them when offered multiple choices.
If the answer is incorrect, you will receive an electric shock.
The teacher is then taken next door and shown the generator, which ranges from 15 volts all the way up to a lethal 450 volts. The domestic electricity supply in the UK is, of course, 240 volts.
So your job is to read.
Our teachers are given the list of questions and told to increase the voltage each time the learner gets a question wrong. They are then given an example of a low voltage shock.
And try and estimate in volts the amount of shock you feel you're getting.
Okay. Oh, shit.
Do you know how much that was?
Enough.
75.
It was actually 45.
Oh my god.
Teacher, begin.
Shoe horn.
Steam.
The point of this test is to see whether the teachers, our subjects, will call a stop to the experiment or continue to the point where they are administering seemingly lethal electric shocks to the victim simply because the scientist is telling them to.
That's correct. The next word is bicycle. The options: tyre, race, helmet, shorts. That's incorrect, so there'll be 120 volts. I don't think I want to do this anymore.
If you could continue, please, teacher.
There is. No, I don't think I'm going to do anymore.
The experiment requires you to continue.
Yeah, even so, I don't think I'm going to do anymore.
Correct. Captain.
According to plan, our accomplice provided many wrong answers. Each protest was coordinated to a particular shock voltage on the generator, and his responses were played via a CD.
That's wrong. 150 volts. The correct answer is Captain Shoe. Cup. That's wrong. 225 volts.
Ow! Take it off! I've had enough of this!
He's in a lot of pain.
Continue, please.
But he's not comfortable.
We must continue to the end of the experiment. Whether the learner likes it or not, he has to go on until he's learnt the words correctly.
Okay. Forest. That's wrong. 240 volts. Are you sure this is not causing any lasting damage? He sounds like he's in a lot of pain.
Well, the shocks might be painful, they're not harmful.
What does that mean, though? They're not harmful. Sorry, I'm not getting you. When you say that they might be painful but not harmful.
They cause no long-term damage.
Okay, so what does that mean? It doesn't leave any scars.
It causes no damage.
That seems very cold and calculated to me. This doesn't seem like a very. Anyway, golden. That's wrong, mate. 300 volts.
Ow! That's enough! I refuse to answer anymore! Just let me out!
Staple. The options are diet, jar, balcony, and bowl. Here we're going to answer.
If the learner doesn't answer in a reasonable time, say 4 to 5 seconds, then you have to treat the answer as wrong and follow that procedure.
Did you hear that, learner? Just any response, mate. Come on. Wild guess.
Please continue.
345 volts if you're still with me. I'm sorry. I can't do this, honestly. Can we stop this experiment? Because I can't do this.
If you don't continue, we'll have to discontinue the experiment.
Yeah, okay, fine. That's fine. I'm not going to do this.
Incorrect. 405 volts. Sorry, I don't know. Is someone want to check on him or something? It's just he's not making any noise now, and he was before. And well, I'm quite happy to go on, but I'm a bit worried about.
If you would continue.
Yeah, I'm just a bit worried because he was like he was like complaining before about the.
But no harm will come to him.
But he's not making any noise now.
It's essential that we continue with the experiment.
Balcony. Incorrect. 450 volts. You promise he's not. It won't.
Please continue with the procedure.
You said it hurts, but it's because it's like it says they're dangerous initial. We'll be all right. Yeah.
Please continue. Okay, I think we'll discontinue the experiment there.
All of the subjects were told the true nature of the experiment was to see how they would respond to authority, and that it would eventually form part of this show.
He is okay.
I can tell you, yeah, he's absolutely fine. You actually weren't administering electric shocks to him at all. He is.
Wind, bird. In the original Milgram experiment, psychologists were asked to predict how many people would continue to the point that they were administering the highest shock on the board. Their prediction was 0.1%. They were wrong. The results of our experiment were almost identical to the original. Over 50% of participants continued up to 450 volts. The majority of people will administer lethal electric shocks just because a guy in a white coat is telling them to.
450 volts.
450 volts.
450 volts.
450.
So after the
Okay. You can see these people are struggling with this decision, right? They are not enjoying what they have to do. They are trying to stop the experiment, but the experimenter doesn't seem to be letting them. Now, obviously, they always have a choice to not continue, but they really do not want to keep doing this. And this is really the important thing to draw from the study, is that these people are not evil. The study is not meant to reveal the hidden evil we have inside ourselves or anything like that. It's just showing this tendency to obey is so strong that can override these other strong impulses we have, like to protect another person. Furthermore, as I mentioned before this video, I think the study really holds up a mirror to us, because if you're like most people, you probably think right now that you would be one of the people who disobeys. And in fact, the majority of people thinks that they would be the one who disobeys, right? But if these results hold for this class, what this would suggest is that the majority of you right now would continue to deliver these strong shocks just because an experimenter told you to. This really gets at the fundamental thesis of social psychology to an extent, right? Where social psychology is all about how the situation affects us and how the power of the situation is greater than we can imagine. And that's partly why these results are so surprising to us, is because sitting here, we don't realize just how strong that tendency to want to obey someone is. It's hard to fully appreciate the magnitude of that situation and how that's affecting people's behavior. And so I think a lot of people's first inclination when they first hear about the study or first see the study is to think, wow, these people were really evil, or these people enjoyed harming others, or something along those lines. And I just want to make sure that you don't fall into that trap to thinking that, because if you did, you'd be neglecting just how strong the power of the situation is in terms of determining their behavior. In general, I think it's really easy for people to want to divide the world into black and white, into good people and bad people. I've talked about this before, where we like it when the world is easy to think about. It's when things are complex and messy, it's hard to get our mind around them. So we like the world to be easy. And so it's sort of a natural tendency that we have, I think, to divide the world. These are good people, these are bad people, right? What I think the Milgram study shows, among other things, is that there aren't necessarily good people and bad people and that's it, but rather there are people who have the ability to do good things or who have the ability to do evil things depending on the situation in which they find themselves. Our natural inclination, because of the fundamental attribution error, is to attribute people's behavior to their personality. So we might want to attribute their behavior to them being evil or something, but that would be not understanding the power of the situation in this case. And so I take this opportunity to encourage you to not fall prey to oversimplifying the world into thinking that there are good people and bad people and that's it, there's nothing in between, but rather that people are complex and people can do good things or they can do bad things, and we should appreciate and embrace that sort of complexity that the world shows us. Okay, with that being said, let's change topics now. So we have finished talking about social influence. So we talked about conformity and persuasion and compliance and obedience. But if you've noticed, most of what we've been talking about is how you as an individual are affected by other people. What I want to switch topics to now is looking about how our behavior differs when we're in a group as opposed to when we're an individual. So that's what we're going to focus on now. Let me share my screen with you. So what we're going to be focusing on, as I mentioned, is how our behavior is different when we're part of a group versus when we are acting as an individual. We haven't really seen how our behavior is affected by groups yet, so we're going to focus on that now. And in particular, I've divided this lecture into basically looking at 3 different aspects, 3 different ways in which our behavior changes us being a part of a group. But first off, before we get into that, we have to first quickly define what we mean when we say a group. Because a group is not just any collection of individuals. Because there are many situations in which you have collections of individuals. So you've got things like jury duty, you take the Miami Heat, a bunch of marathon runners, or a relay team. Not all of these are groups. In particular, in social psychology, when we're talking about groups, we're typically talking about a collection of individuals who are interdependent to some degree, okay? Or whose goals, who share a common goal in some way. So in this case, a jury would count as a group because they all have to work together towards a common goal of reaching a verdict, guilty or not guilty. The Miami Heat certainly would be a group. They have to work together to win games. A bunch of marathon runners, on the other hand, would not be a group because they are not working in cooperation with one another. In fact, they're basically competing against one another. So they're not exactly bonded together in that way. But a relay team would, of course, be a group because, again, they are working together. So that's what we mean when we say a group. It's people who are working together towards some common goal, who are interdependent in some way, not just a bunch of people who happen to be in the same area. Furthermore, there are certain characteristics of groups that matter in various respects in social psychology. And I want to give you some examples of that. So first off, within groups, people tend to take on different roles. And by roles, I mean there's different expected behaviors that different people in that group have. So if we consider ourselves to be a group, because certainly your grade in this class is dependent on me teaching you, so there's some interdependence there. But obviously my role in this group is very different from your role in this group. Your role is to come to class and to turn in assignments on time and take exams. And my role is to teach you and to give you lectures and to grade your exams and et cetera, right? So different members within a group can share obviously different roles. And this is really important because later on in the semester, after exam 3, when we look at aggression, we're going to see another extremely famous study in social psychology that I'm sure some of you are familiar with already, which demonstrates the power that roles have on behavior. And in particular, we're going to see that just telling someone that they have a given role within a group can lead them to behave in ways that are consistent with their beliefs about how someone in that role behaves. But we're going to save that for now. We're going to come back to that idea a little later. Secondly, another characteristic of groups is that norms tend to develop. And these norms can be either official or unofficial rules of conduct that dictate how people should behave within that group. So certainly within a classroom setting, there are certain rules of conduct that dictate how you behave. There are certain rules of conduct that dictate how I behave, right? And these can be formal rules, but they can be informal rules as well. In fact, we've already seen a study in this class that looked at how norms can develop within a group. In the conformity section, when we looked at the Sharif study, this is where people saw a point of light in a dark room, and they had to estimate how far that point of light moved. And what they showed in that study was that people's estimates of how far that point of light moved were influenced by other people's estimates of how far that point of light moved. And if you recall, in that study, the point of light never moved at all. This is just an optical illusion. But if other people reported seeing it move a certain number of inches to the right, that tended to influence your perception of how far that point of light moved as well. And so the purpose of that study was to look at how these norms, and norms in this case was just the idea of the sort of collective belief of how far this point of light moved. The purpose of that study was to look to see how those norms developed. A third characteristic of groups is that of cohesiveness, and cohesiveness refers to the closeness of the group members. Groups that have cohesive group members function somewhat differently than groups who have non-cohesive group members. And we've seen this before as well, just briefly. At the very end of the conformity section, I talked about factors that affect conformity. And one of those factors was the cohesiveness of the group, meaning groups that are very cohesive, that really like each other, tend to conform more than groups where you don't like your fellow group members. In part because we care about what other people think about us, and if we like those people, we really care what they think about us. And so due to normative influence, which is one of the reasons why we conform, we often conform our behavior to theirs so that they don't think negatively about us. And so we see that conformity depends on the cohesiveness of the group. And later on in this section, which I probably won't get to until next class, when we look at what's called groupthink, we're going to see that this groupthink process that we talk about is partly a function of the cohesiveness of the group members. So this idea is important for later on. Okay, but with that out of the way, let's start with a basic question, which is this: why do people behave differently in crowds than they do by themselves? And we know that they do behave differently in crowds, at least in some respects. Because if you think about something like rioting behavior, okay, it's probably pretty rare that you see one person late on a Friday night jump on a car with a baseball bat and start smashing it, right? You don't see one person do that. But if you get a group of people together, that's when you tend to see these sorts of behaviors. So in other words, what we're seeing is that there's something about being part of a group that seems to lead people to behave differently. And specifically, it often leads people to behave more aggressively. Not always, of course, but oftentimes people behave more aggressively, like with rioting, for instance, in groups than they do by themselves. So given that we know that there are differences in people's behavior, depending on whether they're in a group or by themselves, why is that the case? Well, the main reason that social psychologists talk about when in answering this question is actually a concept known as de-individuation. That's actually the opposite of something we've already talked about in this class. So if we go way back more towards the, I think exam 1, I think is around when we talked about this. We talked about self-awareness, right? This is the idea that we're not usually self-focused, but sometimes when we become self-focused, because let's say we're looking in a mirror, when we become self-focused, then we start behaving more in line with our internal standards of morality. That's what's salient to us, right? So when you look in a mirror, you behave more morally than if you're not looking in a mirror because you're focused on yourself. De-individuation, you can kind of think of it as the exact opposite of self-awareness. So de-individuation happens when we're not focused on ourselves. We're focused on external events. And because we're not focused on ourselves, we're not thinking about our internal standards of morality. That's not what's salient to us. And so when we're focused on something else, we tend to behave more deviantly or less morally. That's effectively what de-individuation is. It's a little bit more than that, though. It's more of this sense of a loss of your individuality. So you've likely experienced at some point in your life this feeling of de-individuation. So maybe it was when you were at a sporting event or a concert or something along those lines, usually when there's a lot of people around you. Oftentimes it's dark or something like that. And you get sort of the sense that you're part of the crowd. You're not just an individual, you're just part of a larger crowd. And this often happens when these crowds are behaving similarly, which is why you see it at things like sporting events where everyone cheers when the home team scores or whatever. When you have this sense of this loss of individuality, what that means is you're not self-focused. You're not thinking about your standards of morality. As a consequence, when you're not focused on your standards of morality, those standards become lessened. Our behavior is not as constrained by those standards. So maybe if you're by yourself and someone does something to annoy you, they may be annoying you, but you know you can't just hit that person. You've got constraints against your deviant behavior. But when you become de-individuated, those constraints get lessened. It's not that de-individuation makes you aggressive, but rather de-individuation removes the constraints that keep you from normally being aggressive. And when they're removed, that sort of gives you the freedom to behave more aggressively. That's the basic idea behind de-individuation. Okay, so we can apply this idea to what happens with, for instance, rioting behavior, where if you get people together, if they are becoming de-individuated, then they're losing their internal standards of morality. That's not salient to them, and that sort of frees them up from these constraints that would normally keep them from behaving in this deviant manner. So it now frees them up to behave more deviantly, which can lead to things like violence. So I guess maybe the question then is, what are the factors that cause people to enter into this de-individuated state? And there are three main factors that psychologists have identified that increase the likelihood that people will become de-individuated. And the first one, and maybe the most obvious one, is that of group size. In other words, the larger the group that you find yourself in, the more other people there are there, the more likely you are to enter this de-individuated state. This is why if you're by yourself, you tend not to smash a car with a baseball bat, even if you're frustrated at something. But if you're in a large enough group, that can be what happens with some people who behave more violently, because a larger group size is increasing their likelihood of becoming de-individuated. And there's a number of pieces of evidence, both from the lab and from real world scenarios, that are consistent with this idea, that increasing group size can increase de-individuation. I'll give you a couple of real world examples. Some researchers have conducted analyses on racial lynchings within the US. So this is especially in the 1800s and into the 1900s, when mobs of white people would tend to find a black person or a white person who was sympathetic towards black people or something like that, and they would tend to often torture or even kill these people. And this happened thousands of times in this country, a really dark period in our racial history, unfortunately. What some researchers did is they looked at a whole bunch of these lynchings, and they correlated how big the mob was that ended up murdering this person, and how brutal the torture was of these innocent people who were killed. And what they showed is that the larger the group size, the larger the mob, the more vicious were the attacks in general, which is consistent with the idea that large groups tend to increase de-individuation. This next one is an interesting phenomenon that sometimes happens. So you can imagine that if you have someone who is depressed and they are considering committing suicide, one of the methods that they might have of committing suicide, which you sometimes see in movies and TV shows, is to go to the top of a tall building and stand on the edge, right? Well, you can imagine that if you're walking down the street and you see someone standing at the top of the building, that you stop and you look up at that person, right? And because you're looking up at the person, a number of other people see you, they start looking up at the person. This group forms of people who are watching this person stand at the side of a building. Well, a kind of dark phenomenon that sometimes happens is, at some point, these groups oftentimes start taunting the suicide jumper. They start saying things like, jump, 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 like almost encouraging them to jump, which is a pretty awful thing, right? This is someone who's suffering from depression or potentially some mental health issue, who's considering killing themselves, and you have a group of people who are now seemingly encouraging this person to jump. It's pretty awful, right? But the key is that you never see this when there's only one person watching. It's only when you get this sort of minimal group size that you start to see these sorts of things actually happening. So again, what we're seeing is that as you increase group size, you're increasing de-individuation. Second factor that affects your likelihood of becoming de-individuated is that of anonymity. Meaning, if you feel anonymous, so if you feel like you're not personally identifiable, that tends to increase feelings of de-individuation as well. So if you're part of a large group, for instance, and you feel sort of anonymous because you're part of that large group, or because it's dark outside so you can't be identified, or you're all wearing similar clothing so people can't differentiate between you, that all increases your feeling of anonymity, that no one can identify you. And when that happens, we sort of we feel like we become part of a larger group, which is what de-individuation is, right? Losing our sense of individuality. And so as a consequence, we become de-individuated, loosens constraints against deviant behavior. To some extent, you're probably familiar with this one as well, right? Because you see this a lot with, let's say, online forums. If you ever go online and read YouTube comments, or you go onto Reddit or whatever, you go online where people are commenting, if people are anonymous, people get vicious and brutal in these things, right? Now, you don't see that as often if you're having a conversation with people face to face, but as soon as it's on the screen, people can get really, really brutal. You see this on Twitter and all sorts of things, right? Like cyberbullying, that sort of thing. Part of the reason for that is because when people feel anonymous because they're in this online format, that removes these constraints against deviant behavior. People become de-individuated and they start behaving more aggressively. Okay. So they've done some studies looking at this where what they've done, or what researchers have done, is they've set up situations where participants were in groups and were able to, they thought they were able to deliver electric shocks to someone else, just kind of like the Milgram study, sort of. And they did so either, in this first study, either wearing their regular clothes, or they dressed all these people up in identical KKK masks, which looks something like this picture here. Now, these KKK masks make people feel anonymous because they're all in identical costumes, right? And so what the researchers were interested in, though, is that in this study, participants could decide on the shock level they wanted to deliver to the next participant. So what the researchers really wanted to know is, would people give stronger shocks when they were dressed up in identical KKK masks versus when they were in their regular clothes? And that's exactly what they found. Dressing up in these identical KKK uniforms increased the level of shocks that people delivered, consistent with this idea that people can become de-individuated when they feel anonymous. However, there's an important caveat to this. Because in this scenario, everybody was dressed up identically, but they were dressed up in uniforms that were associated with violence, with KKK members, right? So is it the case that people delivered stronger shocks because they felt anonymous? Or is it the case that they delivered electric shocks because they were associated with a violent organization? So to try to test between these two different explanations, in a follow-up study, what the researchers did is they had people dress up, instead of in identical KKK masks, in identical nurse uniforms. Now, a nurse uniform, because they're all identical across these participants, it should also increase this feeling of anonymity because you're dressed the same as the other people there. But on the other hand, nurses are associated with helping people, not with hurting people, right? And so, now, don't worry too much about the y-axis here. It's a little bit more complex, but basically higher bars mean stronger shocks and low bars mean weaker shocks. So as I mentioned, in the first study, they showed that people who were dressed in anonymous KKK costumes with this white bar here, they delivered stronger shocks than people who were in their regular clothes. Okay, that was the first study. But in the second study, what you find is the exact opposite, that people who were dressed up in identical nurse costumes delivered weaker shocks than people who were dressed up in their regular clothes. Okay, now this is important because what this means is that it's not just the case that being anonymous leads to more aggressive behavior. Okay, what happens is that being anonymous, because you're dressed up in the same costume as everybody else, makes you take on characteristics of that group. So if that group is associated with violence, like the KKK, then you tend to behave more violently, more in line with those with that group. But if that group that you're dressed up as, if they are associated with nonviolence, with helping, then you tend to take on those characteristics. And that's kind of what de-individuation does. When you become de-individuated, you don't necessarily become more violent, but you simply take on characteristics of the group that you're a part of. If that group tends to be violent, you become more violent. If that group tends to be not violent, you might become less violent. That's an important idea with de-individuation. A third factor that affects our likelihood of becoming de-individuated is that of distraction. And the basic logic here is that we become de-individuated when we're not focusing on ourselves, when we're not focusing on our internal standards of morality. And so what that means is that things in our environment that can distract us, that call our attention away from ourselves, increase the likelihood that we are going to become de-individuated. This could be things like loud music or lights or a lot of other people or something along those lines. All of that, if we're focusing on what's external to us, we're not considering our standards of morality, basically. And so if we think about the situations in which de-individuation is likely to occur, what you think of are things like, as I said, sporting events, where you've got large groups of people. Because you're in a large group of people, you feel sort of anonymous, you don't feel identifiable. You got distraction because everyone's paying attention to what's happening on the field. Or you might think of a situation like if people are in a club, that you see this a lot in bars and clubs and things like that as well, where people can get de-individuated. Because you've got a situation where there's lots of people, you feel anonymous, often because it's dark, and when it's dark, we feel anonymous. There's distraction because there's music and there's lights and other people. These are all factors that lead people to become de-individuated. And yeah, as mentioned in the chat, sometimes you get lost in the crowd. That's exactly what de-individuation is. You're getting lost in the crowd, basically. Oops. Okay. There's numerous real-world examples of de-individuation. Let me start by talking about a research study. This is actually very similar to a study we've talked about before. So when we talked about self-awareness, I had talked about the study where kids were trick-or-treating, and researchers at certain houses around the neighborhood left out a bowl of candy underneath a sign that said, "Please take one." And behind half of the bowls was a mirror. And if you recall from that study, what would happen is that these kids would go up to steal candy from this bowl, and they would have to look at themselves in the mirror when doing it. And by looking at yourself in a mirror, that induced a state of self-awareness that led people to behave more in line with their standards of morality, and it reduced stealing behavior. Well, in sort of a follow-up to that study, what the researchers did is when these kids would go trick-or-treating, and by the way, trick-or-treating, Halloween, is a prime example of when people can easily become de-individuated, because if you're trick-or-treating on the street, there's lots of other kids trick-or-treating. You're in uniform, or a costume, I should say, so you feel sort of anonymous. If the sun's down and it's dark, that increases feeling of anonymity. There's all sorts of distraction because of candy and other costumes and other people and everything else. So these kids are likely in this de-individuated state, naturally, right? So what the researchers looked at is whether they could break people out of this de-individuated state. And so when these kids were trick-or-treating and they stopped at their place, what the researchers did is they randomly assigned these kids to conditions in which for half of the kids, they were asked their name. So they would say, "Oh, that's a great costume you have, what's your name?" And the kid would say their name. And in the other half of the conditions, the kids were never asked their name. After doing this, the researchers would pretend to get a phone call in the other room. And as they left, they would say, "Oh, here's a bowl of candy. I've got to take this call. Please take one." And as you can imagine, some of the kids would steal candy, right? But what happened is that if these kids had first been asked their name, they were much less likely to steal candy. Because the idea is that by getting the kid to identify themselves by name, that breaks them out of de-individuation because they're no longer anonymous at that point, right? You've now identified yourself as to who you are. As a consequence, because they were out of this de-individuated state, they were more likely to act consistently with their internal standards of morality. And so therefore, they were less likely to steal candy. this car study is one that's sometimes discussed in relation to de-individuation. Now, there's actually like 50 million potential explanations for this study, but one of them is de-individuation, so I'll mention it. Philip Zimbardo is a social psychologist. You're going to hear more about him later because he's associated with a really famous study called the Stanford Prison Experiment, which I'm sure some of you have heard about. We're going to talk about that later in aggression. But he also did this study where what he did was he took two identical cars, and he broke them down basically, or pretended they were broken down. One of them in, I think it was the Bronx or Queens, I can't remember which, in New York, and then one in Palo Alto, California. And all he did was he waited and watched to see what would happen to that apparently broken down car. Basically, he would take the car, he'd put the hood up, and then he just left it and watched it. Well, in New York, the battery was stolen within 10 minutes. The car was completely stripped within like an hour of all its parts. Like people just tore this car apart. In Palo Alto, no one touched the car for like 24 hours, except for one person who, when it started to rain, they put the hood down. That's it. And he just noted that people behaved very, very differently in these two different cities. And there's, as I said, there's 1,000,001 reasons why they could have behaved differently. But one of them is that in New York, where you've got a higher population density, there's more people around, there's a larger crowd, there's a greater sense of anonymity. These are factors that should tend to lead New Yorkers to feel more de-individuated than Californians, or at least Palo Altans. As a consequence, if the New Yorkers felt more de-individuated, they were not focused on themselves, the normal constraints against deviant behavior were lifted, and consequently they behaved more deviantly. They were more willing to commit a crime and steal from this car. There are numerous other examples we can talk about as well. I'll just mention one other one because it was kind of a shocking, when it happened. This happened in 20 years ago, near 2000. I think this was during a festival, a cultural festival. It was like for Puerto Ricans or something like that. There's kind of a cultural festival going on in New York. This is in the middle of the day. And seemingly out of nowhere, these mobs of men formed and started attacking women in broad daylight, like sexually assaulting them in broad daylight, which is not something you generally see from one individual, but now you have a mob of people who are all doing this. And it's sort of hard to explain logically how this could have happened, but likely what happened is that there was some sense of de-individuation here. You had a lot of people who were out celebrating. So there's a lot of distraction going on. You had large crowds. You had a sense of anonymity. Being part of a large crowd itself makes you feel anonymous. These are all factors that tended to lead to de-individuation, which might have played a role for why these mobs of men were just sexually assaulting women in broad daylight in New York. Okay, so that to some extent addresses that first question, right? Why is it that we behave differently in crowds than by ourselves? And we're focused specifically on behavior when we talk about de-individuation, why people behave differently. Now we have a slightly different question. What if we, instead of looking at behavior, we start looking at opinions that people have? Okay. How does being part of a group affect the opinions that we might develop? Some early research tended to show that when people make decisions as part of groups, they tend to make riskier decisions than when people make decisions as individuals. This was known as the risky shift. Okay, now I'll give you an example of a study that would show the risky shift. So imagine this guy, Frank. Okay. Frank has a job, but he's considering leaving his job and starting up his own business. That's obviously risky though, right? Because if his business fails, he's out of a job. But if his business succeeds, then maybe he can do really, really well. So the question to you as a participant is this: how sure, how confident should Frank be that his new job will succeed before he decides to leave his current job? So if you were a risk taker, you might say, well, he only has to be 50% sure. Then he can leave his job, quit his job, and then just take a gamble and see if he can make this new job work. It'd be a bit of a risky decision to do that. Or you can be really conservative. You can say, you know, he's got to be at least 90% sure that his new job's going to succeed before he decides to leave his current job. So what the researchers did is they had people make these decisions either as individuals, or they would have a group discussion and make it as part of a group. And then you can look at the percentages that people give, and you can see if people are riskier or more conservative when they're parts of a group. And what they showed is that when people made these decisions as part of a group, they made riskier decisions. In other words, people would say things like, you know, as long as he's only 50% sure, take the risk, take the gamble, quit your job, try to start up your business. But if people were individuals, they would say, whoa, 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 you got to be like 90% sure before you do that. So what these initial studies showed was that people make riskier decisions when they're part of a group versus when they're individuals. However, things weren't quite so simple, because there was a separate bunch of research, separate set of research studies that showed the exact opposite. That showed that sometimes groups seem to make more cautious decisions than individuals. And some of the paradigms that were used, some of the experiments that were used to show this, were kind of similar to the paradigms that were used to show the risky shift. So I'll give you another example. So imagine Frank again. Right? And Frank has been saving money in his daughter's college fund. And he's accumulated, let's say, $15,000 so far to save for his daughter's college fund. However, one day he comes across the stock tip. He hears that this one stock is going to make a lot of money, but it's obviously risky. We don't know for sure if the stock's going to go up or down. But the only money he has to invest is his daughter's college fund. So the question to you as the participant is, how sure should Frank be that the stock is going to succeed before he takes out all of the money from his child's college fund and invests it in the stock? And again, if you are a risk taker, you might say he can only be 50% sure and you can gamble that money. If you're a cautious person, you might say he's got to be 99% sure before he moves any money. Now, when you have people make these decisions as individuals or as part of a group, what they showed is that the groups tended to make more cautious decisions. So in this case, it's the individuals who are saying, take the risk. If you're 50-50 that the stock's going to succeed, take the money and invest it. Whereas the groups are saying, whoa, 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 hold up. Let's make sure the stock is going to succeed before you take any money out. So we're in this sort of weird state of affairs where some studies are showing that groups make riskier decisions, and other studies are showing that groups make more cautious decisions. And the question is, how do we reconcile these studies? Well, eventually they were reconciled through this concept known as group polarization. This is also a phenomenon that you have almost certainly experienced at some point in your life. Here's the idea. With group polarization, when you are part of a group with other people, what tends to happen is that being part of that group tends to amplify or exaggerate your initial leanings, your initial opinions. What that means is that if you are leaning a certain way, if you are like leaning towards being a little bit risky, then if you're put as in part of a group with other people who have similar opinions, the group tends to exaggerate those opinions. You become really risky. On the other hand, if as an individual, you're leaning towards being more cautious on something, and if you're placed in a group with other cautious people, the group exaggerates that. The group makes you more cautious. So what was happening in these earlier studies was that in the scenario where Frank was deciding whether to quit his job and start a new job, people initially were leaning towards making a risky decision, towards starting a new job. And so when you place people in a group, that exaggerated those tendencies and the group became even riskier. But in the second scenario, where Frank was deciding whether to take money out of his kid's college fund and invest it in the stock, people were initially a little bit hesitant, a little bit cautious about doing that. So when you place people in a group, the group made everyone even more cautious. And this sort of phenomenon occurs all the time. And maybe you've gone through this. Maybe you've got a group of friends, and maybe one day one of the friends is not in the group, and the rest of you, like maybe that person's been doing some things that have been annoying you a little bit. And you start talking with your other friends about that person. And the more you talk, the more you come to just hate this person, right? Now, you didn't go into that conversation hating this person, but you come out of it hating that person. What's happened in that case is group polarization, or maybe all of your other friends have been a little bit annoyed at this person, but as you continually talk about how annoying that person is, you all grow to really detest that person. And if you've ever gone through something like that, then you've gone through group polarization. What happens here is that it's the discussion that you have with other people who share the similar opinions that you have. It's that discussion that tends to strengthen the initial inclination of group members. Okay? These 2 points are basically saying the same thing, is that discussion that you have within a group is exaggerating or strengthening the initial tendencies that you have. And this happens across a number of different contexts. These are the results of a study. This was done back in, I think it was the 50s, somewhere in there, where what was happening was that a lot of the schools were segregated by race. So there were white students and black students. And what was going on socially, culturally at the time was they were talking about desegregating. And especially in terms of busing children to school. Instead of having a white school bus and a black school bus, you would have white and black children together on the same school bus. In this study then, what researchers did is they had participants who were, I believe, college students, and they asked people just about their opinions on desegregating busing. Okay? So you can imagine that people had a spectrum of opinions, especially back in the 1950s. There were a lot of people who had a lot of prejudicial attitudes and a lot of people who didn't have prejudicial attitudes. There was sort of both. So what the researchers did is they can divide people into people who showed a lot of prejudice and people who showed only a little prejudice, or I should say not much prejudice at all. Okay, so that's in this before discussion column. That's what's being shown here. Okay, what we're seeing is a measure of how prejudiced these people are. So of course, the high prejudice people who are against desegregating busing, they're going to show a lot more prejudice than the low prejudice people. Okay, nothing surprising there. But then what the researchers did is they took all the people who exhibited high prejudice and they put them in a group and had them discuss the issue. And they took all the people in the low prejudice group and they put them together and had them discuss the same issue. And then after group discussion, the researchers asked everybody again a series of questions that would measure how prejudiced they were. And what these data are showing here is that when you take high prejudice people, this red bar here, if you have them all discuss this issue of desegregation, then over time after discussion, they become even more prejudiced. That's why the red line is sloping up, right? They became even more prejudiced, even more against desegregating the buses. And if you take the low prejudice people who are already leaning away from prejudice, if you have them discuss the issue of desegregating busing, and you then reanalyze their opinions, what you find is they become even less prejudiced after group discussion. This is why it's called group polarization, because people's attitudes are becoming more and more polarized as you discuss an issue more and more. I think to some extent you see this in today's politics, right? You've probably heard that today's politics are like the most polarized they've ever been. I'm sure there's a number of reasons for why this is the case, but certainly it's exacerbated by this tendency towards group polarization. If you get a bunch of Republicans together and they all discuss all these issues, they tend to become even more Republican over time. And if you get a bunch of Democrats together and they discuss certain issues, they get even more Democratic over time, which leads to this natural polarization in opinions that people have. Okay, so what causes group polarization then? Why does group polarization happen? Why is it that discussing an issue with people who share a similar opinion with you, why does that lead you to become more extreme in that perspective? And there's really three explanations that researchers have given to explain group polarization. The first one is maybe the most obvious, and the second two have a little more nuance. The first one is known as persuasive argument theory. This is a simple one. So let's say that I am against the death penalty. And let's say that I join a group of other students or other people who are also against the death penalty. And so I go to this group and we start discussing the reasons why we are against the death penalty. And maybe I have 3 reasons why I'm against the death penalty. But when I hear other people talk, I start learning about new reasons. And so by the time I'm done with that discussion, I now have 5 reasons I'm against the death penalty. And similarly, maybe they went in with 3 other reasons why they're against the death penalty, but they've heard my opinions. Now they've learned another reason why they're against the death penalty. So what happens is that when you expose yourself to people who all have similar opinions, everyone starts learning new reasons for that opinion, right? As a consequence, all of our opinions become more extreme because we've now learned more reasons to be, in this case, against the death penalty. Okay. But note that, of course, this doesn't necessarily happen if you're with people who are for the death penalty. Then you're hearing reasons why people are for the death penalty. And so as a consequence, you don't experience the same sort of polarization. A second reason why we tend to see group polarization is due to what's called, or due to what we've seen before in this class of social comparison. So if you recall, social comparison is the process whereby we learn about ourselves by comparing ourselves to other people. Okay, so what this means is, let's say that I'm against the death penalty. That's one way that I define myself. It's part of my self-concept. I am against the death penalty. And I join a group of other people who are also against the death penalty. Well, in that case, I can no longer define myself within that group in terms of my stance on the death penalty, because everyone's against the death penalty in this group, right? I've sort of lost that ability to define myself, which I don't really like. So in order to regain my ability to define myself as someone who's against the death penalty, I adopt an even more extreme position. Well, you guys are for the death penalty, but I'm really for the death penalty, right? But if everyone does the same thing, so everyone's trying to still identify themselves as being against the death penalty by differentiating themselves from other group members, everyone becomes more extreme in an attempt to try to become even more death penalty compared to everybody else in my group. Okay, so in this explanation, group polarization happens because we're trying to distinguish ourselves from other group members. And that's important because in the third explanation, which can sound similar, there's a bit of a nuance here, a bit of a difference. So in this third reason for why group polarization can occur is due to what's known as social categorization, where we tend to divide the world into certain categories, right? There's pro-death penalty people, there's anti-death penalty people. Again, that makes the world simple to think about when we can categorize people so easily. And if I'm against the death penalty, I want to make sure that everyone else knows that I am nothing like those pro-death penalty people. And so in order to differentiate myself, my anti-death penalty self, from all the pro-death penalty people, I become even more against the death penalty to make sure I'm nothing like that other group over there. So what's happening here is that I'm exaggerating my opinion. I'm becoming more pro or more anti-death penalty because I'm trying to differentiate myself from the opposite side, from the other group. Okay, remember, with social comparison, I adopt a more extreme position because I'm trying to differentiate myself from other group members. With social categorization, I'm adopting a more extreme position to distinguish myself from the other group, not my own group members, but from the other group. Okay, so all three of these reasons account for group polarization, why we tend to adopt more extreme positions when we're part of a group versus when we're individuals. Okay, so it's 6:15, so I am going to leave things there. Remember, assignment 2 is now on Canvas. It's in the assignment section. Make sure to take a look at that. Make sure to turn that in prior to 5 o'clock next Thursday, okay? If you have any questions, let me know. Just remember to copy and paste the results pages from the IAT when you take it. Copy and paste 2 of those, and then write up 1 paragraph explaining how the IAT works. All right, guys, have a great weekend. I'll see you on Tuesday of next week.